An arranged marriage between two strangers sparks an unexpected journey of pain, betrayal, and love. But when the past returns to destroy everything they've built, will they hold on or let go? If it were you, standing at that crossroad, what would you choose? Before we begin the story, let us know where you're watching from by leaving a comment below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story. Ethan Carter stormed into the penthouse suite with a quiet, simmering anger that twisted the air around him. He hadn't expected to see her like that, perched at the edge of the bed, bathed in soft lamplight, her dark skin gleaming like burnished onyx. She sat there wrapped in a white silk robe that clung to her frame with a grace too natural to be staged. And when she met his eyes, it wasn't with fear nor with awe, but with a calm, assessing look that rattled him more than any accusation ever could. She didn't ask if he was her husband. She said it, just like that. And in that moment, Ethan realized this arrangement, this corporate-made marriage, wasn't going to be the clean, clinical transaction he'd imagined. Her name was Ila Nova, a tech magnate with a mind as sharp as the code her company wrote. Nova Technologies was the crown jewel missing from his father's empire. Their marriage wasn't born from love or even attraction. It was inked in boardrooms, signed off by lawyers, toasted by men who believed love was just another tool in the power game. Ethan had agreed out of duty, not desire. A dying man's last gambit to cement a legacy. He thought he could stomach it. Thought he could live beside a stranger with the cold detachment of a business deal. But nothing in those carefully signed documents had prepared him for Ila. Her obsidian eyes, her unnerving poise, the way she carried silence like a weapon. From the start, Ethan built walls. He didn't believe in love, not after watching his mother walk out on his father and on him. Not after learning that love could be twisted into a knife made of guilt and betrayal. On their wedding night, standing in that cavernous penthouse, he laid down his terms like a contract: respect in public, privacy in private, and no expectations of his heart. Ever. He'd meant it, or at least he thought he did. What he hadn't expected was how Ila met his icy declaration with nothing but a nod. She accepted, on one condition: that he remember every word he'd just said, because she warned one day he might wish he hadn't. She said it softly, without threat. But Ethan felt that certainty hit him harder than any shouted argument ever could. Ila wasn't here to be anyone's pawn. She hadn't been forced into this marriage. She chose it with the same ruthless calculation he thought belonged only to men like him. And when she agreed to his terms, it wasn't surrender. It was control. That realization caught Ethan off guard. Because how do you fight someone who's not afraid of losing? The early days of their marriage played out like a silent film, two strangers orbiting each other in a luxury apartment that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Ethan left before dawn, came back after dark. Ila mirrored his movements with the grace of a shadow, always present, never intruding. They spoke in calendar invites and post-it notes, businesslike, efficient. And for a while it worked. Until silence grew so loud at night, Ethan found himself listening for the sound of her soft footsteps in the dark. He told himself it was habit. He told himself he didn't care. But lies taste bitter when you're the one swallowing them. Ethan had been raised to see love as a liability. His father, once a man who had loved too deeply, and loss taught him that only ruthlessness survived. Attachments were weaknesses, emotions, distractions. So when the merger marriage was proposed, Ethan didn't flinch. What was there to lose? But Ila, with her unnerving calm and sharp mind, didn't fit into the boxes he'd prepared. She wasn't a chess piece. She was a mirror, and she reflected things in him he didn't want to see. Ila carried her own shadows. She had trusted once and been burned so badly it scarred her faith in everything, most of all herself. She wasn't chasing love now. She wanted safety. A controlled partnership with no strings, no risks. The contract with Ethan promised that. And yet the man she'd expected to be cold steel turned out to be something else entirely. Beneath the anger and arrogance was a sadness she recognized too well. The kind that felt like an old wound still raw beneath the skin. Somewhere in the middle of the quiet, something began to shift. Not loudly, not suddenly, but in glances held a second too long, in small, unspoken gestures. Ethan lingering at the coffee machine just to see her pass by. Ela finding his favorite scotch and leaving it on the counter without a word. They weren't falling in love, not yet, but they were noticing. And noticing that was the first crack in the walls they'd both sworn to keep standing. This marriage was supposed to be a business deal. Clean, controlled, predictable. But what neither of them saw coming was how this arrangement, a cage they both had willingly stepped into, was unlocking something raw and painfully real. It wasn't love. But maybe it was a start. The idea that two broken people, each scarred by their past, might actually find a way to fit. Not perfectly, but honestly. Ethan told himself it was temporary. Isla told herself it was strategy, but neither of them reached for the exit. They stayed. Not for legacy, not for power, not even for the illusion of security. They stayed because beneath all the legal clauses and icy words, something was growing. Something neither of them dared to name. A fragile, stubborn hope. And hope that dangerous, inconvenient thing wasn't part of any contract. But sometimes, it's the only thing worth risking everything for. The room was too quiet for what had just been said. Ethan's voice still lingered in the air like smoke, harsh and unforgiving. I will never love you. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even anger. It was a verdict spoken like a man laying down the final stone over a grave he'd already dug for his heart. He stood there tall and rigid, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up just enough to reveal the veins along his forearms, tension threading through every inch of him like a wire pulled too tight. He was expecting a reaction, tears maybe or outrage. He was prepared for resistance. What he wasn't prepared for was silence. Ela didn't flinch. Her eyes met his and held. Calm, deliberate, unsettlingly serene. If his words had cut, she didn't bleed. Instead, she stepped forward just enough to make him feel the warmth of her presence, but not enough to touch. She asked him one thing. Not to reconsider, not to soften, not to promise someday. Just this, remember. Remember that he said it. Every word. Because the day might come when he'd wish he hadn't. And then, without waiting for his answer, she walked past him toward the bathroom with the kind of grace reserved for royalty or survivors. The door clicked softly behind her, but the echo of her words stayed with him, ringing louder than any slam could have. Ethan ran a hand through his hair and sat heavily on the edge of the couch, the luxurious fabric beneath him doing nothing to ease the discomfort twisting inside. This was exactly what he'd wanted. No mess, no confusion, no feelings. He'd drawn the line early, marked the boundaries, made the rules. But now, all he felt was like he'd fired a bullet into still water and was watching the ripples come for him. Slowly, inevitably. They didn't speak again that night, not beyond the necessary pleasantries. Ethan offered to sleep on the couch, and Isla, ever poised, replied that the bed was large enough for two adults to coexist without drama. He insisted. She didn't argue. But when she turned out the light with a quiet goodnight husband, her voice was so gentle, so final, that it felt like a small funeral for something neither of them had ever allowed to live. And in the darkness, with the silver slice of moonlight tracing the line of her body beneath the sheets across the room, Ethan lay wide awake, wondering why the silence between them felt like punishment. That was the thing about Isla. She didn't fight the way people expected. She didn't scream. She didn't throw things. She didn't try to change his mind. Her strength was quieter. It lived in the way she didn't chase validation, in the way she met rejection, not with desperation, but with dignity. And that unnerved Ethan more than any argument could have. He could have handled fury. He knew what to do with hurt. But this stillness, this composure, it made him feel like the cruel one, like the one who'd missed something important without even realizing it. Over the next few days, he threw himself into work like a man running from ghosts. Meetings, numbers, projections, everything had its place. Everything could be measured. Everything except the feeling that no matter how full his schedule was, the penthouse was too quiet when he got home. Isla didn't sulk. She didn't pry. She simply existed in her own orbit, gracious and composed, always one step away from reachable. Her laughter with the house staff was genuine. Her presence in the kitchen was soft, but confident. She was living, adapting, becoming part of his world without ever asking for space in it. And that made him uneasy. Ethan wasn't used to guilt, but there it was creeping in every time he saw her curled on the sofa with a book, the firelight playing across her skin, or when he caught her humming softly as she reviewed spreadsheets in the home office they rarely shared. He'd drawn the line. He'd made the rules. And now he was the one staring across them like a man outside a house he used to own. The line he'd thought would protect him now felt like a cage of his own making. And Hila, she wasn't even trying to cross it. She had honored his vow. The problem was, now he wasn't so sure he wanted her to. One night, returning home early, he found her on the balcony, barefoot in a loose robe, hair undone, sipping wine as the city pulsed below. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just watched her. The way the wind caught her hair, the way her shoulders moved when she exhaled, the way the light from inside made her look more human, more real than anything he'd ever allowed himself to want. When she turned and saw him, she smiled. Polite, distant, like a stranger welcoming a guest, and that cut deeper than her eyes ever could. Ethan said nothing, just nodded, poured himself a glass, and sat beside her. The silence between them wasn't tense. It wasn't even awkward. It was just filled with everything they weren't saying. She didn't ask why he was home early. He didn't ask what she was thinking. They sat side by side, two people sharing air and memories they hadn't made yet. And for the first time since that night, Ethan let the vow echo in his head, not as a declaration, but as a question. Would he really never love her? Or was he simply too afraid to try? In the weeks that followed, that question became a shadow in every room they shared. It lived in every near touch, every too long glance, every unfinished sentence. Ethan kept his distance. Hila didn't push, but something had shifted. His vow, meant to be a shield, was becoming a mirror. And every time he looked at her, he saw less of the stranger he'd married, and more of the woman he couldn't stop thinking about. The woman who had accepted his cruelty with grace. The woman who, without demanding anything, had somehow become the center of a life he didn't know he wanted. The rain came fast and without mercy, pounding against the glass walls of the penthouse like it had a score to settle. Thunder rolled across the sky so violently the windows trembled and the air inside seemed to hold its breath. Ethan stood in the entryway, soaked to the bone. The collar of his coat limp from the storm, his briefcase forgotten at his feet. For once he was home before midnight, not by design, but by the storm's interruption. Outside, the city blurred into streaks of silver and shadow. But inside, he heard music low and rich, like velvet spilling from the living room, drawing him forward before he could think better of it. He moved quietly, his footsteps muffled by the rug, his eyes adjusting to the flickering candlelight that dotted the space. And then he saw her, Hila, dancing barefoot on the wooden floor, her skin kissed gold by the flames. Her body moving in sync with a rhythm only she could fully hear. She was unguarded, hair loose, cascading down her back in soft waves. The oversized shirt she wore fell off one shoulder, revealing a glimpse of skin so elegant it stopped him cold. He had never seen her like this. Not the poised CEO, not the polished wife, just a woman dancing alone, letting the storm rage around her while she remained entirely at peace within it. Something in him stirred. Something that had slept too long and now refused to be ignored. He should have turned away, should have made noise, should have given her warning, but instead he stayed hidden in the shadows, watching her, as if watching a secret unfold. Her eyes were closed, lips parted slightly, and he realized she wasn't dancing for anyone, not even herself. She was simply being alive in that moment, real and whole and untouched by the expectations that weighed on them both. His heart ached with something he could not yet name. When the floorboard creaked beneath him, she startled, her body halting mid-spin, her eyes wide as they met his. For a moment, the air between them shimmered with something delicate and raw. Ethan opened his mouth to apologize, but no words came. Hila reached for the remote, silencing the music. The silence that followed was deafening. He stepped into the room slowly, unsure of what to say. unsure of why his chest felt so tight. "The power's out," he said finally, the words catching on his tongue, a ridiculous thing to point out, given the obvious, but it was all he had. Isla nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I noticed." They stood facing each other in the dim glow of candles, the shadows dancing around them like curious spirits. Ethan had faced hostile investors, boardroom ambushes, and international negotiations, but nothing had ever left him so unsure as the way she was looking at him now. Not angry, not embarrassed, just quietly expectant. He felt the moments stretching between them, taut with the possibility of something new and terrifying. So he said the only true thing he could think of. "You dance beautifully." Surprise flickered in her eyes before softening into something warm. "Thank you," she replied. Then silence again, and lightning flashed, illuminating her face in stark relief. For a split second, she looked like a painting come to life. Ethan took a step closer, drawn not by desire, but by gravity, the kind that pulls tides and stars. He could smell her now, rain and something floral and faintly sweet, like home, if home had ever been a place he recognized. She was looking at him with curiosity, as if trying to decide whether he was a dream or a danger or both. He reached for the wine bottle she had opened, pouring himself a glass. The candlelight reflected off the dark red liquid as he lifted it in a silent toast. "To storms and stolen moments." Isla smiled, then raised her own glass. "To unexpected company," she said, and something in her voice wrapped around his ribs and stayed there. They drank not as strangers, not as partners in a corporate alliance, but as two people momentarily stripped of pretense. Her fingers brushed his when she set down her glass, and the contact sent a jolt up his arm, like electricity chasing heat. They ended up on the floor side by side, leaning against the couch. A blanket between them, the candles flickering, casting long shadows that moved with the wind outside. Ethan found himself talking more than he had in months about landscapes and photography, and the way he used to get lost in silence when he traveled. Isla listened, really listened, her eyes never leaving his face, her expression soft and open and kind. She told him about her mother, about code, about how she always felt like she had to prove herself twice as hard for half the respect. He watched her and thought, not for the first time, that he had misjudged her, that maybe he had misjudged himself too. When she laughed at something he said, a real unguarded laugh that curled at the edges and spilled into the quiet, he found himself laughing too. Not because it was funny, but because it felt good. And when the storm finally began to ease and the city started to breathe again, they stayed there on the floor, surrounded by shadows and candlelight. Hearts thudding like thunder far away, and something had shifted. Not in the way of grand declarations or sweeping gestures, but in the way their knees touched, and neither of them moved in the way their hands brushed and stayed close, not quite touching, but close enough to promise they might tomorrow, when words returned. And daylight came again, with it the fragile courage to rewrite everything that had once felt final. The night had settled softly around them, wrapping the penthouse in velvet shadows. The only light came from the candles they had forgotten to blow out after the storm, and the glow of the city below that filtered in like a quiet secret. They sat across from each other on the couch, legs barely brushing, shoulders relaxed more than either expected. Ethan held his wineglass loosely between his fingers, watching the way the light danced in the depths of Isla's eyes. She was so composed even now, so careful, yet something about the night had shifted. Her posture had softened, her guard lowered, and he felt the pull of wanting to know her more than her company title, more than her function in this strange marriage. He wanted her story, the one she never told. "Tell me something real," he said. Voice quiet. Not a challenge, not a demand, just a request, laid down gently between them like an open palm. Isla looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing the cost of truth. Then she nodded once and set her glass aside, her fingers twined in her lap. When she began to speak, it was not in bitterness, but in clarity, as though she had rehearsed the story in her head 100 times, but never aloud. "I was supposed to marry someone else," she said. Her tone even, but her eyes distant, A man named Victor. We were engaged for almost a year. He was charming, driven, brilliant in that intoxicating kind of way that makes you forget to look deeper. Ethan listened, his chest tight, though he didn't fully understand why. Maybe it was the softness in her voice or the fact that this was the first time she'd shared something personal, something unguarded. Isla continued. We built plans together, future projections, rings, venues, even talked about children. I thought he saw me, she said, eyes flicking to him. I mean, really saw me. Not just what I could build or own, but me. But I was wrong. And I didn't realize it until the morning of our wedding when I walked into his office and found the contracts he had drawn up, not for our life, but for the merger he planned to force between my company and his. Her voice didn't break, but it wavered, and Ethan felt something twist hard in his chest. Betrayal was an old song to him, but hearing it in her voice made it new again. She kept speaking like a current pulling itself forward, unable to stop. He had been using me for over a year, cultivating trust, laying groundwork, and in the end he planned to dismantle everything I built. Use our marriage as leverage, steal my patents, and turn me into a figurehead with a pretty face and no power. She looked away, then blinking too fast. I walked out that morning, called off the wedding, destroyed the NDAs, and fired half my staff. Some of them had been feeding him information for months. I rebuilt from the ground up because I had to. Silence followed her confession, but it wasn't awkward. Ethan felt it fill the room with weight and meaning. He reached across the small space between them, his fingers brushing the back of her hand. Not gripping, not claiming, just letting her know he was there. Her skin was warm and trembling slightly, and that vulnerability undid him in a way he hadn't expected. I'm sorry, he said quietly, and meant every syllable. Not just for what happened, but for what it had cost her, not just the company, but her ability to trust, to believe, to love. Isla looked down at their hands for a moment, then turned her palm to meet his and curled her fingers around his. Voice so low, barely carried through the room. I didn't agree to this marriage because I was over him, or because I wanted revenge. I agreed because your father offered me honesty. And after Victor, that felt like the most valuable currency in the world. A deal without lies. No false hope, no expectations of affection. I thought it would be safe, uncontrollable. Ethan's thumb brushed the inside of her wrist, slow and deliberate, feeling the beat of her pulse and the courage it took for her to share this. But somewhere between signing the documents and sharing the home with me, she continued, something changed. I started noticing the way you always refill the kettle before you leave my life. The way you never let anyone else drive when in the car, as if my safety is your unspoken priority. The way you listen, even when you pretend not to. And I realize safe doesn't mean distant, and clean doesn't mean cold. Maybe I was wrong about what I needed. And maybe I'm starting to want what terrifies me most. Ethan's breath caught at her words, the rawness of them, the quiet intimacy in being seen and still accepted. He leaned in then, not because the moment demanded it, but because his heart did. His forehead resting gently against hers, her breath warm against his skin. They stayed like that for a while, neither moving, just existing in that perfect fragile balance of almost and maybe. Her hands were in his lap, his fingers tangled in hers, and he realized he didn't want to be her arrangement, her refuge, or even her safety net. He wanted to be her choice, her risk, her unknown. And he knew suddenly that she had already become all of those things for him. When they finally pulled back, there were no declarations, no grand gestures, just the steady thrum of connection humming between them. Ethan looked at her and saw not the woman his father had chosen, not the CEO who shared his name, but the person who had been hurt, rebuilt herself, and still dared to trust again. And Isla saw in him not the man who had once vowed never to love, but the one who now held her pain like something sacred, and promised silently to never be the one who added to it. And in that look they understood that whatever came next, they would face it side by side, no longer strangers, no longer just survivors. And as the last candle flickered low, casting golden light across the space between them, Ethan pressed a kiss to her knuckles, soft and reverent. And for the first time since their wedding night, Isla closed her eyes, not out of weariness but out of peace. Her heart no longer barricaded her soul, no longer braced for impact. Because now she knew she wasn't alone in the storm, and neither was he. They had found each other, not through love at first sight, but through pain, shared walls broken. And slowly, piece by piece, the past no longer held them hostage, because in each other they had found not a perfect beginning, but a fearless continuation of something real. Something worth staying for. The gala was supposed to be routine, a parade of polite handshakes, well-heeled compliments, and staged smiles, the kind of evening where everything sparkled and nothing truly mattered. Ethan had played the part dozens of times, polished to perfection in his tailored tux, with a practiced smirk and an impenetrable composure. But tonight felt different. Perhaps it was the way Isla had looked when she stepped into the room, a vision in deep sapphire, her presence so radiant it made the chandeliers seem dim. Or perhaps it was the weight in the air like a storm gathering above silk and champagne. They had found rhythm lately, a tentative, unspoken partnership forged not from romance, but resilience. Shared meals laced with wary smiles. Quiet glances across the breakfast table where silence no longer felt like avoidance, but understanding. And tonight, as Ethan offered his arm, and she took it as naturally as if they had always walked side by side, he felt something shift deeper than he dared name. Until the moment the crowd parted, and he saw him, Victor Grayson. Tall, calculating with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. A ghost from her past, wrapped in expensive arrogance, walking toward them like a man who believed the room still belonged to him. Ethan felt Isla go still beside him. It wasn't overt, not enough for anyone else to notice, but he knew her body now. The subtleties of her breath, the way her fingers flexed slightly against his sleeve, and that was all it took. Victor's smile widened as he approached. And for a brief second, Ethan wasn't a CEO or a husband or even a man in love. He was something primal, protective. The instinct to shield her from whatever this man represented ignited in his chest with such force it surprised even him. Victor greeted them like old friends, too loud, too smooth, congratulating Ethan on the merger while barely disguising the condescension in his voice. Then came the words that turned the evening from uncomfortable to catastrophic. "I assume Isla told you we were engaged," he said casually, lifting a glass to his lips. "Just months before your wedding, actually. She left me at the altar. But I suppose you already knew that." Ethan felt the words like cold steel sliding beneath his skin, not because of the content, but because of the delivery. Public, deliberate, designed to destroy. Isla stood frozen, her expression unreadable, but her eyes betrayed her a flicker of pain masked by years of training, but not fast enough to escape Ethan's notice. Guests were beginning to turn, subtly drawn by the tension, the undercurrent of scandal brewing, just loud enough to stir curiosity. Ethan stepped forward slightly, voice low enough for privacy but sharp enough to cut. This isn't the place, he warned. But Victor's grin only deepened. "When would be?" he asked. "After your next board meeting? Or after your quarterly earnings call?" "I just thought transparency was important, especially when marriages overlap with corporate strategy." Ethan saw red, not the impulsive rage of a man slighted, but the cold, lethal fury of someone watching the woman he cared for being weaponized against him. Victor wasn't there to reminisce. He was there to plant seeds of doubt, seeds that would bloom in boardrooms and shareholder meetings, questioning loyalties, motives, legality. His endgame was clear: discredit the merger, destabilize the Carter-Nova alliance, and reclaim what he believed had been stolen. Ethan could feel the weight of eyes on them, see the subtle camera flashes, catch the angles of their discomfort. But none of that mattered when he looked at Isla and saw not a calculated player, but a woman standing on the edge of a battlefield she never asked for, facing down a past that refused to stay buried. He turned to her then, not to question, not to demand, but to offer his presence. His silent, unwavering alignment with her. Whatever storm Victor was conjuring, Ethan wasn't going to let her face it alone. Later, as they sat in the back of their car, the city lights blurring past like unfinished thoughts, Ethan broke the silence with a question that cut deeper than it sounded. "Were you going to tell me?" Isla stared out the window, jaw-clenched, eyes bright, not with tears, but with fury and shame. "I didn't think it would matter until it did," she said quietly, And now it does, doesn't it? He didn't answer, not immediately. His thoughts were a storm of timelines, motivations, and all the pieces now falling into place. She turned to face him, then her voice trembling but steady. You want the truth? Fine. I left him because he betrayed everything I believed in. I married you because your father made a deal that didn't require pretending. And yes, I thought it would be easier, cleaner, if we kept our scars out of sight. Her vulnerability struck him harder than any boardroom blow. She had been protecting something, not her reputation, but perhaps his, trying to hold their fragile peace together with silence. Ethan reached for her hand, not because he knew what to say, but because touch was the only thing that felt real. I believe you, he said simply, not as a favor, not as a concession, but as truth. Because beneath all the revelations and strategic chaos stood a woman who had never lied to him, only withheld the part of her that hurt most. And now she had laid it bare. And he saw her not as a CEO or a wife or even a partner in crisis, but as the only person he wanted beside him when the dust settled and everything else had fallen away. As the car pulled up to the penthouse and the doors opened to the hush of luxury and the stillness of their home, Ethan knew the war had only just begun. Victor would return with more accusations, more pressure, more venom dressed as evidence. But tonight, the line had been drawn not between right and wrong, but between past and future. And Ethan had chosen. He was no longer the man who made vows in fear and distance. Now he was the one standing in the fire beside her, ready to burn or rebuild depending on what came next. And as he held her gaze before they stepped out into the dark, he made a silent promise that whatever storm was coming, they would face it not as strangers, but as something unbreakable, together. It didn't happen all at once, not in a rush of passion or a lightning strike moment of clarity. Instead, it arrived quietly, like spring melting the frost beneath the surface of a frozen river, inch by inch, almost imperceptibly until the first flowers quietly pushed through. Ethan only began to notice when the world felt different. He started to see her in ways that transcended power plays and perfectly tailored appearances. He noted the softness in the way she tucked her hair behind her ear as she read. He heard the gentle hum that escaped her lips when she dug deeply into a problem. He realized that the hallway lights remained on every evening until he stepped through the door. Not because she waited with eager anticipation, but because she saw his need for light when he came home. She cared, and she showed it without fanfare or declaration. One morning he came down to find her asleep on the sofa, wrapped in a favorite but frayed blanket, her laptop half open and resting on her chest. Dawn's pale light spilled across her face, highlighting her eyelashes, the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. He paused, not because she looked flawless, but because she looked real, human, safe. He couldn't bear to wake her. Instead, he slid into the armchair beside her and simply watched her rest. In that stillness, memories of old promises reverberated. He'd once vowed he would never give in to feeling again. But here he was watching the one person who made that promise begin to unravel from within. It was in the small, everyday things that his heart betrayed him. The way she'd grin at his praise of her code structure. The way her fingers reflexively reached for his when crossing a crowded street almost without her noticing. And then there was the night she fell ill with the flu, declined every offer of help until he arrived with soup and a humidifier, staying by her side until the pale sunrise rode in. She leaned into him at 3 a.m, whispering thank you so softly it could have been wind through the curtains. And he felt something deep inside shift in response. Not love exactly, but something tender and seismic. They began to cook dinners together without planning it. She'd materialize beside him in the kitchen, peeling and chopping vegetables, while he stirred the simmering sauce. Their shoulders brushed, their steps fell into a syncopated rhythm, as if directed by some unseen conductor. Ethan caught himself watching her not because he was surprised, but with that faint glowing realization that this moment felt natural, like finding your hand in someone else's, and knowing without question it was where you belonged. One quiet evening, she paused in the middle of reviewing contracts with her brow furrowed in concentration and looked up at him. I forgot how peaceful this could feel. She murmured, her voice a soft confession. He didn't ask her to explain. He didn't have to. He simply absorbed the moment, the weight of her words, the warm lamplight that haloed her hair, the falling slow of comfort in her eyes. In that instant, the distance between them closed. Their spaces no longer felt separated but aligned, like two instruments that had finally ticked to the same tempo, producing a melody only they could hear. Silence spoke volumes, and no words were needed. Ethan had once believed that love was grand cinematic, a conflagration, a tempest, something battlefield-worthy. But what unfolded with Isla proved otherwise. Their love was quiet and unwavering, like a seed finding its root in fertile earth, not demanding attention or spectacle, but gradually growing, subtly claiming its place. He realized his walls were coming down. He wasn't holding himself apart any longer. He was falling, and for the first time in history, he found himself hoping that the fall wouldn't ever end. One Sunday night, they curled up on the leather sofa to watch an old black and white film. Isla leaned her head on his shoulder. A worn blanket covered them both. When the film faded and the credits rolled, neither moved. Her body against his felt like an anchor in a world that otherwise spun with relentless ambition. She turned ever so slightly, and he glimpsed that unscripted smile, soft, unguarded, beautiful. Without planning it, he lifted his lips to her temple. It wasn't a question. It was a gentle answer to everything neither had yet spoken. Her hand inched across the blanket and found his. Their fingers wove together with delicate ease, as if they had done it 1,000 times before. In that fragile moment, he understood that he hadn't broken any vow. He had rewritten it. The love he had feared wild, explosive, was not weakness or chaos. With her, love was steady. It was real. And it was right there beside him, in a woman he'd once claimed as nothing more than a strategic alliance, but now realized was the only truth his heart yearned to live by. As the night deepened and city lights softened beyond the windows, they stayed like that still, hearts synced, breaths hushed. In the comforting quiet, every gaze, every flick of thought said what words could never express. And in that perfect silence, he felt the shift. For the first time since the frigid wedding night when his heart had firmly shut itself off, Ethan Carter felt openly, unabatedly, irrevocably in love. With intention, with care. And against every rational expectation, he had chosen her, and in choosing her, he chose to experience love in full. Later, as the first pale wash of morning filtered through curtains, he held her a moment longer before letting sleep claim her again. He brushed a gentle kiss to her forehead and whispered softly, "Thank you for staying." She murmured something in her sleep, a mix of gratitude and belonging. And in that quiet gesture, he knew their souls had spoken. They had charted a future that wasn't predetermined by contracts, boardrooms, or cold strategy. It was written by moments like these, unscripted, raw, and true. Sometimes love arrives not with fireworks, but hidden in a glance. It seeps in through small acts, through daily proximity, through vulnerability and time. It shows up in the hum of a melody, a lingering hand, a quiet breath shared in the dark. Ethan's vow to never fall had become a promise to keep unfolding, and he knew that with Isla it would only deepen. She had quietly rewritten his definition of love and restored his capacity to feel. And now, as sunrise spilled across the room, he was certain that he had fallen into exactly the right hands, and that this love, earned quietly and steadily, would endure far beyond any storm. The test sat between them on the bathroom counter, silent and small, yet impossibly loud. Its blue lines were stark against the white, like a whisper echoing into forever. Isla stood frozen, her fingers still clenched around the wrapper, her breath trapped behind her ribs. Ethan was at her back, not touching, not speaking, just there. His presence quiet and grounded and necessary. For a long moment, they said nothing. The hum of the light above them, the only sound in the room, until she slowly turned to face him and met his eyes with something like awe and something like fear and something more beautiful than both. "We're going to be parents," she said. The words quiet like they might shatter if spoken too loud. But they didn't shatter. They landed between them like a promise, something fragile, yet undeniable. Ethan's jaw tightened, not with dread, but with disbelief. And then he laughed. Not the kind he used at galas or meetings, but a sound that cracked open from somewhere real. He reached for her, cradling her face with both hands, and kissed her forehead. His lips lingering, as if trying to memorize the moment before whispering, "I'm with you. Whatever this means, however, this changes us. I'm already yours. And now I'm hers too." That night, the world felt different. They lay tangled in sheets, her head resting on his shoulder, his fingers drifting over the flat of her stomach again and again, as though by touching her, he could anchor the truth in his own body. Neither of them spoke much, but every silence felt full, like music without words. When she finally fell asleep, Ethan stayed awake, watching her, wondering how this woman who had once been a stranger had become the only constant that made sense. And when the morning light poured in through the curtains, he pressed a kiss to her temple and whispered, "Good morning, my girls." And the words didn't scare him, they grounded him. The weeks that followed became a quiet ritual of discovery. Doctor appointments that made Isla tear up when she heard the heartbeat for the first time. Ethan squeezing her hand so tightly it trembled. He downloaded every book about fatherhood he could find, stayed up late reading medical articles, memorizing trimester symptoms, and baby milestones like exam prep for a life he couldn't wait to start. She teased him for his sudden obsession with nutrition, but still ate every soup he made, even the bland ones, because he had tried. And when the nausea came and the exhaustion settled into her bones, he carried her to bed without a word, ran warm, baths, rubbed her feet, and never once asked for gratitude. Because he had already found his purpose, and it began and ended with her. They started talking about names. She made a list in her phone, and he would secretly add to it after midnight ridiculous ones, sweet ones, family names with quiet legacy. One night, as they sat on the balcony with a blanket around their shoulders and stars overhead, she asked him if he was scared. He didn't lie. "Yes," he said, "because I've never done this before. But no, because it's with you." Her eyes filled with tears, and she leaned into him, saying softly, "I don't know how we got here." He answered barely above a whisper, "Maybe we didn't get here. Maybe we built it. One day at a time. One look. One silence. One moment. And now it's real." When the doctor said it was a girl, Isla broke not in fear but in wonder. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she pressed her hands against her belly, like she could hold the entire universe inside her. Ethan stood behind her arms, wrapping around her waist, anchoring her, holding her together as she cried. Later that night, as he painted the nursery in soft shades of lavender with music humming in the background, she sat in the doorway watching him. Watching his hands move, his brows furrow and focus, his quiet smile when he stepped back to examine his work. And she thought, this man who once vowed never to love is now painting hope onto drywall, into corners, into dreams. When he caught her gaze, he smiled. And it was the smile of a man who had been found. The night their daughter arrived was cold, the city wrapped in snow. The hospital room hushed, but full of waiting. Ethan held Isla's hand through every contraction, every breath, every push. When the first cry filled the room, it didn't sound like fear. It sounded like arrival, like destiny knocking, like the world expanding in one impossible, perfect breath. When the nurse placed her in his arms, he looked down at that impossibly small, perfect face and felt everything inside him realign. The years of silence, the walls he had built, the names he had answered to, they all fell away. There was only this moment, and her. This is what it means to live, he thought, not in wealth, not in conquest, but in weightless awe. Isla watched him through a haze of exhaustion, her eyes still full of wonder, and he walked to her, kissed her forehead with reverence, and whispered, "Thank you. For this. For her. For you." As they sat together in that white room, dawn creeping gently across the sky, Their daughter between them, tiny, warm, miraculous. They didn't need to say anything else. Everything had already been spoken in the quiet, steady language of becoming a family. And for the first time in his life, Ethan didn't want to go anywhere. He didn't want more. He just wanted this forever. The phone rang at 2:17 a.m., shattering the quiet like a gunshot. Ethan sat up instantly, heart-hammering dread thick in his chest. Beside him, Isla stirred her hand, reaching for his instinctively. The number flashing on the screen was one he recognized, one he never wanted to see again. Victor's name pulsed on the display like a threat, and Ethan answered, not with a greeting, but with a warning. "What do you want?" he asked coldly. His voice low enough not to wake the baby, but sharp enough to slice through the dark. Victor's tone was calm, too calm, and that alone made Ethan's skin crawl. "I assume you've seen the headlines," he said so casually. Ethan stood, walked out to the hallway, and opened his laptop with trembling hands. The screen lit up with chaos. It was everywhere. Every major outlet from business to scandal blogs splashed with the same story under different headlines. Carter Empire built on fraud. Novatech merge under investigation. Leaked emails implicate Isla Nova in corporate espionage. Ethan scrolled fast, each article worse than the last. Accusations, financial discrepancies, anonymous sources claiming Isla had conspired with Victor before the merger. Screenshots taken out of context. Weaponized timelines warped to create suspicion. It was calculated, it was brutal, and it was working. He looked up slowly, his chest burning with a betrayal he didn't believe but couldn't explain. Then he turned and saw Isla standing in the doorway. Her face, pale eyes wide, filled not with guilt, but something worse, devastation. "I didn't," she said before he could ask, her voice breaking. "I swear to you I didn't do this. I haven't spoken to him in months, not since that night at the gala. He knows things from before, things I told him when I trusted him before he hurt me, before you." She stepped forward slowly, hands shaking, and Ethan froze for a second because everything he felt, rage, confusion, fear, none of it was about her. It was about the idea of losing her, about the way his world had finally begun to make sense, and now it was being torn apart at the seams. He closed the laptop, walked toward her, and cupped her face, whispering, "I believe you. I know you, and I won't let him do this to you, to us." The hours that followed were chaos, lawyers' phone calls, press statements, board members demanding explanations, some calling for resignation, others pretending to stand by while quietly preparing their exits. Ethan fought with the fury of a man who had something real to protect. Not money, not image, but a family. Isla stayed silent during the meetings, but behind closed doors she worked non-stop gathering data, pulling old contracts, unearthing timelines, digging up every digital footprint she could find. Then on the third day, with her hair in a messy bun, eyes red from no sleep, she found it, the buried trail. The falsified metadata, the single server log that proved Victor had accessed her old cloud account weeks after the breakup. Ethan stared at the screen, then at her, and realized she had not just cleared her name. She had handed him a weapon. They held the press conference together. She stood beside him, not as a wife or co-founder, but as an equal. When Ethan spoke, his voice was steady, calm, and surgical. He laid out the facts, presented the timeline, exposed Victor's manipulation, and then stepped back as Isla took the mic and delivered the killing blow. She read the log out loud, line by line, the room's silent reporters scribbling furiously. She ended with a single sentence: "I trusted him once, and he used my trust to break me. But I will not let him use my silence to define me again." Then she looked at Ethan, and in that look was everything they had survived, everything they had rebuilt. That night, after the dust settled and Victor's legal team began to retreat, Ethan stood in the nursery watching their daughter sleep, the glow of the nightlight casting soft shadows on the wall. Isla joined him, a minute later, wrapping her arms around his waist, pressing her cheek against his back. And for a long moment, neither spoke, because there was nothing left to say. Their love had been tested, not by time or temptation, but by fire. And it had not only endured, it had solidified, become something undeniable. Ethan turned, kissed her slowly, and whispered, "We end this on our terms. From now on, always." The next morning, they sat on the balcony, warm coffee in their hands. The city stretched before them, different now, not softer but clearer. Ethan looked at Isla, really looked at her, and asked if she would start fresh with him. No contracts, no boardrooms, no conditions, just them and their daughter, and a future built not from obligation, but from choice. Isla smiled, that slow, deep smile he had come to love, and said, "I already did." As the sun rose over the skyline and their daughter cried softly in the next room, they rose together. No longer two people surviving a world that tried to break them, but one family stronger than any storm. Because this time, they chose to stay. Not because they had to, but because love had become the only truth that mattered. They didn't celebrate with champagne or glittering lights the night the charges against Isla were dropped and Victor was officially indicted. Instead, they ordered takeout, sat barefoot on the living room floor, their daughter asleep upstairs and the television playing some rerun neither of them really watched. Ethan poured them each a glass of wine and Isla leaned her head against his shoulder, not in triumph, but in relief. They had made it through the fire, not without burns, not without scars, but they were still standing, and more importantly, still together. For the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like he was living someone else's legacy. He had taken control not just of the Carter name, but of the meaning behind it. He had built something not with numbers or mergers, but with choices, with love, with sacrifice. And Isla, the woman who once walked into his life like a calculated equation, now laughed freely in his kitchen, danced barefoot to jazz music, and left post-it notes on his laptop that said things like, "Don't forget to breathe, and you're someone's hero." Their home didn't look like the penthouse of two moguls. It looked like a life book scattered on coffee tables, baby toys, underfoot mugs that never matched, and sunlight that warmed more than just the furniture. Ethan would often stop in the doorway just to watch them. Isla, reading on the couch, their daughter curled beside her tiny fingers, tracing the lines of a story neither fully understood. And in those moments, he knew he had everything he had once been too afraid to want. It hadn't been easy. Loving someone who had once taught herself not to trust, and being loved by someone who had learned to hide from his own emotions. But they had done it, one argument, one apology, one act of forgiveness at a time. And now their love wasn't perfect, but it was true. It was earned. And maybe that's what made it matter more than all the fairy tales and picture-perfect romances. They had something real, and real meant showing up especially on the hard days. Ethan had started writing again, something he hadn't done since college. Short entries late at night when the house was asleep. Not for publication, not for prestige, just thoughts about legacy and family and courage and love, and sometimes about fear. He had been a man who thought strength meant silence, who believed that vulnerability was weakness. And Isla, she had shattered that myth just by staying, just by loving him in all the ways he never knew he needed. The merger that began as a business contract had transformed into a foundation not for companies, but for change. Together, they launched an initiative for women in tech survivors of financial abuse and startups, led by young dreamers with nothing but heart and code. They didn't do it for PR. They did it because they knew what it meant to lose everything and start over. They knew the power of a second chance, and they believed in giving it to others. At the launch gala for the program, Isla stood on stage radiant and composed, and for the first time told her full story. Not just the scandal, but the shame, the recovery, the fear, and the love that pulled her from the wreckage. She looked out at the room of strangers and said, "Sometimes, we don't choose our beginnings, but we always have a say in our becoming." And Ethan watched her from the crowd, their daughter on his hip, and he knew no one in that room would remember the old headlines anymore. They would remember the woman who turned betrayal into power and silence into a voice. Later that night, as they walked home through the city, Isla took his hand and whispered thank you. Ethan smiled, shaking his head, and said, "No thank you for making me someone worth staying for." And as the lights of the skyline shimmered around them, he realized the miracle wasn't that they fell in love. It was that they had stayed when it was easier to leave, that they had fought when it was easier to retreat, and that in each other, they had found not rescue, but reflection. Not salvation, but partnership. So maybe this isn't a love story in the way we expect, not the kind built on destiny or serendipity, but the kind forged in fire and tested by the weight of truth. Maybe it's not about perfection, but persistence. Not about how two people came together, but how they stayed when the world gave them every reason to walk away. And maybe, just maybe, it's a reminder that love, the kind that heals, rebuilds, and redefines, isn't something we find. It's something we choose again and again. Would you choose it too if it were your story?